What's the most justified crash out you've ever seen? My brother was a disabled war veteran whose wife died giving birth to their triplets, and despite his PTSD, grief, and chronic pain, he stepped up like no one thought possible. For 22 years, he never missed a game or recital. Even when his back was so bad, he had to lie on the gym floor during halftime just to make it through. He worked 3 jobs and barely slept. But when his daughter Carmen wanted to be a dancer, he still watched YouTube videos at 4 a.m. so he could do her hair in a bun. When his son Michael got bullied, he stood outside that school every lunch break for a month, just so Michael could see him through the cafeteria window and know he wasn't alone. He even relearned algebra at 47 with a brain still foggy from PTSD meds, just to tutor his kids at the kitchen table every night. The man never bought himself new clothes, wore the same 6 shirts for a decade, his shoes held together with duct tape. But those kids had new cleats every season, prom dresses that cost 2 weeks' salary, and gaming computers for Christmas. He never dated either, saying his kids were enough. So when his 60th birthday came around, all he asked for was one thing: to take the train to New York with his kids and try real New York pizza. That's it. 3-hour ride. He'd been talking about it since they were little, how his army buddy from Brooklyn always said you haven't lived until you've had a slice from Joe's. The kids used to roll their eyes when he'd bring it up during dinner. But this year they promised. Carmen even made a whole plan in the family group chat about which train they'd take, how they'd spend the day in Central Park, then get pizza. Michael said he'd cleared his work schedule. James bought the train tickets and sent him the confirmation. My brother actually smiled for the first time in years. He even went to Goodwill and bought himself a new shirt for the trip. The morning of his birthday, he woke up at 5 a.m. like it was Christmas, shaved carefully, put on that new shirt, even tried to stand a little straighter despite his back screaming. He made himself breakfast for once instead of just coffee, humming some old army song. Got to the train station 45 minutes early because he was so excited. Bought 4 tickets even though James said he already had them, just in case there was confusion. He sat on the bench closest to the platform, checking his flip phone every 2 minutes. 7:45 came and went. The 8 a.m. train was boarding. He texted the group chat, "I'm here by track 3. With 3 smiley faces. It took him 5 minutes to find the emoji button. At 8:15, the train left without him. He called Carmen first, but it went straight to voicemail. Michael's phone rang, but nobody answered. James picked up on the 5th ring, said something about car trouble, then hung up before Dad could respond. He sat on that bench for 3 more hours. Other families walked past, laughing, taking their trips. A little kid dropped his ice cream and his dad immediately bought him another one, and my brother just watched them, something breaking in his face. The station security guard asked if he was okay. That's when it happened. This man who buried his wife without shedding a tear in public, who'd been through war, who'd suffered in silence for 2 decades, just started sobbing, right there on the platform. Shoulders shaking, trying to cover his face with his hands. An old woman sat next to him and patted his back while he cried 22 years worth of tears. He rode the train to New York with me, and we ate a slice at Joe's. But I could tell he was devastated. 3 days later, he was driving Carmen to the airport for her work trip. She was in the back seat on her phone the whole ride. 20 minutes in, he quietly said he'd gone to New York anyway, that the pizza was good. She laughed and didn't even look up. "Dad, you're being so dramatic lately." "It's just pizza. We said we'd go another time." He gripped the steering wheel with those damaged hands and said nothing. At the departure gate, she asked for money for airport food. He gave her his last $40. A week later at Sunday dinner, all 3 kids were there, talking about their lives, their plans. Michael mentioned wanting to move into a bigger apartment. James complained about student loans. Carmen showed pictures from her trip. Not one person mentioned his birthday. Not one. He served them dinner like always, his back spasming as he carried the plates. Then Carmen said it. "Dad, you really need to stop this needy thing. We're adults. We have lives. You chose to have kids. We didn't ask to be born. You don't get a medal for doing what you're supposed to do." James nodded and said, "For real though. I was there when it happened, staring in pure disbelief." That's when my brother finally snapped. He stood up from the table, walked to his bedroom, and came back with something that made his kids drop to their knees and beg him to forgive them. The old shoebox in his hands was falling apart at the corners, held together with rubber bands that looked 20 years old. He set it on the table, and the kids just stared at it, confused at first. My brother's hands shook as he pulled off the rubber bands and lifted the lid. The bronze star sat on top, its ribbon faded but the metal still catching the light. Under that was his Purple Heart, the one he got when shrapnel tore through his shoulder in Fallujah. Then came the folded flag from their mother's funeral, the one the honor guard handed him while the triplets screamed in their strollers because they were only 3 weeks old and hungry. But it was the typed letter underneath that made my blood run cold. "If you're reading this, I'm already gone," was all I could see before he shifted the papers, and then I saw the orange prescription bottle sitting right there on top of everything, his pain meds, a full month's supply. Carmen's knees hit the floor so hard I heard them crack against the hardwood. She was sobbing and saying she didn't mean it over and over, snot running down her face, reaching for his leg but not quite touching him. James kept mumbling apologies that didn't even form real words. just sounds coming out of his mouth while he stared at that bottle of pills. Michael hadn't moved at all, just looking at the floor like he'd turned to stone. I reached over slow and casual like I was just looking at the medals, but I palmed the pill bottle and slipped it into my pocket, along with that letter while the kids were too messed up to notice. My brother needed to sit down. His legs were shaking bad, so I got him back in his chair and rubbed his shoulder while his kids stayed there on the floor. I told them they needed to go home right now, that I was staying with their dad tonight. Carmen started protesting, saying they needed to talk about this, fix this, make it right. That's when I used my old teacher voice from when I taught high school, the one that could shut down a classroom of 30 teenagers in 2 seconds flat. They actually listened. Michael helped Carmen stand up because her legs weren't working right, and James opened his mouth to say something, but I just pointed at the door. They left without another word, Carmen still crying, Michael holding her arm, James trailing behind them looking lost. The house went quiet after the door closed. Just me and my brother sitting at that table with the empty shoebox between us. We sat there for an hour without talking, him staring at those medals like he'd never seen them before, me keeping my hand on his shoulder so he knew I was there. Finally, he said he was tired and pushed himself up from the table, walking to his bedroom slower than I'd ever seen him move. I grabbed a blanket from the hall closet and made myself comfortable on his couch, setting alarms on my phone for every 2 hours through the night. The first alarm went off at midnight, and I checked on him. He was sleeping but restless, covers kicked off. The second one at 2 a.m., same thing. But at 3 a.m. I didn't need the alarm because I heard movement in the kitchen. He was sitting at the table with a shoebox I hadn't seen before, this one full of photos. His wife holding the triplets in the hospital bed, looking exhausted but smiling. The kids at maybe 5 years old, covered in finger paint. Carmen in her first dance recital costume. Michael's little league team photo. James winning some science fair. He was just staring at them, spreading them out on the table like he was looking for something. He told me he failed them, that they turned out selfish because he was a bad father, that maybe if their mom had lived, they would have been different. I told him firmly that wasn't true, that he did everything right, that sometimes kids just need to grow up before they understand what they had. He didn't argue, but he didn't agree either, just kept looking at those pictures. The next morning, I waited until I heard the shower running and called the VA crisis line. The woman who answered transferred me 3 times before I got to Laura Butler, a social worker who specialized in veteran suicide prevention. I explained everything while standing in my brother's backyard so he wouldn't hear. Laura said she could see us that afternoon at 2 p.m. and gave me a whole list of things to watch for, like giving away possessions, sudden calmness, talking about being a burden. She said to remove all weapons and medications from the house immediately. While my brother was getting dressed, I sent a group text to the kids saying Sunday dinners were canceled until further notice, and any contact with their father had to go through me first. My phone rang within 30 seconds, Carmen sobbing and demanding to talk to him, to apologize properly. I told her this wasn't about her feelings right now and hung up. She called back 4 times, but I didn't answer. At the VA that afternoon, Laura met us in a small office with motivational posters and a box of tissues on every surface. She helped us create a safety plan, writing everything down on official forms. Lock up all medications. Daily check-ins with me, a list of warning signs to watch for, emergency numbers to call. My brother agreed to everything, but he looked defeated, like he was just going through the motions to make us stop worrying. Laura scheduled him for a medication review with the psychiatrist for the next week and got him into the next support group for combat veterans that met on Thursdays. She handed me a folder full of resources for family members dealing with suicide crisis, numbers to call, websites to visit, local support groups. The stack of papers was an inch thick. After the appointment, I drove us to my apartment and told him I was packing him a bag. He was staying with me for at least a week. He protested weekly about being a burden, about not wanting to impose. I reminded him of all the times he slept on the hospital floors when the kids were sick, all the times he drove them to practices at 5 a.m., all the times he put their needs first. Now it was his turn to let someone take care of him. My phone buzzed with a text from Michael asking if Dad was okay and saying work had been crazy so he couldn't make the birthday trip. I typed back that his father had almost killed himself, and being busy at work doesn't excuse abandoning family, then watched the typing bubbles appear and disappear 4 times before he went silent. The next morning Carmen texted, asking to meet for coffee, and I agreed, watching her walk into the coffee shop 20 minutes late with her phone pressed to her ear, finishing some work call before sliding into the booth across from me. She started crying immediately, mascara running down her face as she explained how she shuts down when things get heavy, because seeing him in pain reminds her of Mom dying, and she can't handle it. I pushed a napkin across the table and told her that's exactly when he needs her most, that avoiding hard things is what brought us here, watching her nod while shredding the napkin into tiny pieces. James called that night while I was making dinner for my brother, his voice defensive as he insisted he really did have car trouble and his student loans were crushing him. I pulled up Instagram on my laptop and found his posts from that morning, photos of him at a bar with friends at 10 a.m., timestamp clear as day, and asked if he thought his father was stupid. He hung up without another word. Over the next few days, my brother and I settled into a routine at my place. 3 meals at regular times, his medications counted out in a weekly pill organizer, and short walks around the block even when his back made him grip the mailboxes for support. He stayed quiet most of the time, but cooperated with everything, which Laura said was a good sign when I called her with updates. I texted the kids that they could see their father, but only with me, present, and for limited time. No exceptions. The first meeting happened in my living room 5 days later, all 3 of them showing up at different times. Carmen 15 minutes early pacing on my porch, Michael exactly on time, James 10 minutes late. They sat on my couch while their father stayed in the armchair, everyone staring at the floor while Carmen mumbled apologies, and James picked at a hole in his jeans, and Michael kept checking his phone until I took it from him. My brother said nothing for the entire hour, just looked at them with tired eyes before getting up and going to his room. The second visit 3 days later started the same way, until my brother cleared his throat and spoke for the first time, telling them he wouldn't be paying for anything beyond essentials anymore. No more phone bills, no more car insurance, no more random Venmo requests for gas money or groceries or bar tabs. They were adults now and needed to act like it. Carmen's mouth dropped open, and she asked how she was supposed to afford her phone bill. He looked her straight in the eye and said she had a job. Figure it out. James started to argue about his loans, but I cut him off immediately, reminding them their father was setting a boundary, and they needed to respect it, or leave. They left. That night I searched online for family therapists and found Suresh Hendricks through the VA website, his profile saying he specialized in veteran families and crisis intervention. I called the next morning and explained our situation, while my brother showered and Suresh said he could see us, but wanted to do individual prep calls with everyone first to understand the dynamics. My brother agreed to try it when I told him sessions would be structured with clear time limits, no open-ended talking for hours. Suresh called me first, and we talked for 40 minutes about the family history, my brother's service, his wife's death, the years of sacrifice and what triggered this crisis. He called each kid separately over the next 2 days, and when he called me back, he said privately that parentification. And emotional neglect in military families was more common than people realize, that kids of veterans often can't see their parents' trauma because they're too focused on their own survival. The first mediated session was scheduled for the following Tuesday at the VA center in a small conference room with fluorescent lights that made everyone look sick. My brother pulled out a folded piece of paper from his shirt pocket, hands shaking slightly, as he smoothed it on the table. He read slowly, describing how he felt at the train station watching other families laugh and take their trips, while his own children forgot he existed. How that little boy getting a replacement ice cream made him realize his kids had never once put him first. How he sat on that bench for 3 hours, hoping they'd show up, even though he knew they wouldn't. Carmen started crying halfway through. Real tears this time, not the performative kind she used to get out of trouble as a teenager. James shifted in his chair over and over, looking at the door like he wanted to bolt. Michael stared at his father's hands on the table. Those damaged hands that had held them as babies, taught them to ride bikes, applauded at every single event for 22 years. Suresh let the silence sit for a full minute after my brother finished reading. The only sound Carmen's sniffling and the air conditioning humming overhead. Suresh finally leaned forward and placed both hands flat on the table, looking at each kid individually before asking them to name one specific time their father had put their needs before his own health or well-being. Michael shifted uncomfortably and stared at the wall clock for almost 30 seconds before admitting he remembered his dad driving him to soccer practice with a fever so bad he threw up in the parking lot, but still stayed to watch. Carmen wiped her nose with a tissue and described how he'd sold his truck to pay for her dance academy tuition, even though it meant walking 2 miles to work every day for a year. James kept fidgeting with his phone case and eventually mumbled about the time his dad spent his grocery money on James's college application fees and ate nothing but rice and beans for 3 weeks. Suresh nodded and asked them to consider how many similar sacrifices they'd never even noticed, then turned to Michael and asked directly why he'd been avoiding family dinners for the past 6 months. Michael's hands clenched and unclenched on the table as he finally admitted that being around his dad made him feel guilty because he knew he was taking advantage but didn't want to change, that it was easier to just stay away than face those feelings. Suresh wrote something on his notepad and turned to James, asking about the car trouble on the birthday morning, and James's face went red as he looked down at the table, and admitted there was no car trouble. He'd been hungover from a party the night before and didn't want to deal with a family day when he felt like crap. The admission seemed to break something open in him, and he started talking faster about how he felt like a failure compared to his siblings, how Carmen had her career, and Michael had his steady job while he was still struggling with loans and dead-end work, how asking his dad for money made him feel pathetic, but he kept doing it anyway. Carmen interrupted to say at least he answered Dad's calls, and Suresh asked what she meant, which led to her pulling out her phone and showing that she'd muted the family group chat 4 months ago because she couldn't handle the emotional labor of family planning on top of her work stress. Suresh pointed out calmly that her father had handled that same emotional labor alone for 22 years. While working multiple jobs and managing chronic pain, and Carmen's face crumpled as she nodded and said, "She knew. She knew. She just didn't know how to fix it. My brother had been silent through all of this, but when Suresh asked if he had anything to add, he cleared his throat and said he was done waiting for them to figure it out, that starting tomorrow he was canceling the family phone plan and they had 30 days to get their own plans set up. The kids' faces showed genuine shock. Carmen asking how much that would cost, and my brother pulled out a piece of paper where he'd already written down the phone company's number and the account information they'd need. He also announced he'd be closing the joint emergency account at the bank that they all had cards for, that he'd already called. And it would be shut down by Friday, and James actually went pale and asked about his student loan payment that auto-drafted from there. My brother looked him straight in the eye and said that wasn't his emergency anymore. James would need to figure it out like any other adult. Suresh asked if the kids wanted to make any concrete commitments to rebuilding trust, and after some back and forth, Michael said he could drive his dad to physical therapy appointments twice a month, which was specific and trackable, not just empty promises. James pulled out his wallet and counted out $50 in tens and fives, sliding them across the table to his father and saying he'd pay back $50 a month from what he owed over the years, starting right now. My brother took out a small notebook and wrote down the date and amount, saying he'd track every payment going forward. Carmen struggled more, saying her work travel made it hard to commit to anything regular, but Suresh challenged her to find one consistent thing she could maintain. And after several minutes of thinking, she agreed to a weekly phone call every Sunday at 7 p.m., no matter where she was in the world. The session ended with everyone looking drained, and we scheduled another meeting for 3 weeks out, though Suresh said he was available sooner if needed. Over the next 3 weeks, my brother stuck to every boundary he'd set, ignoring the kids' texts asking for money, refusing to remind them about the phone plan deadline, letting them figure things out themselves. Michael actually showed up for the first physical therapy appointment, awkwardly helping his dad with the exercises while the therapist guided them. James made his second $50 payment on time, handing it over at my apartment where his dad was still staying. Carmen called that first Sunday from an airport lounge, keeping it short but asking about his day and his back pain. Then 3 weeks in, my brother's back went into full spasm while we were grocery shopping, his legs buckling in the cereal aisle as he grabbed the shelf to keep from falling. I helped him to the car and drove straight to urgent care, texting the kids from the waiting room that we were at the hospital, deliberately not adding any details to see who would actually show up and who would make excuses. Carmen arrived within an hour, rushing through the automatic doors still in her work clothes, and for once she didn't make it about herself, just sat quietly in the uncomfortable waiting room chair next to me and asked how long we'd been there. I told her about 20 minutes, and she actually sat there quietly for once, not checking her phone or complaining about missing work calls. The doctor came out after another hour and said my brother's back muscles were in complete spasm, gave him a muscle relaxer injection right there in the exam room. Michael showed up just as we were getting the discharge papers, rushing through the doors still in his work uniform from the warehouse. He helped his dad stand up from the wheelchair and walked on his left side while I took the right, and we got him to my car real slow. Back at my apartment, Michael went straight to work setting up the old recliner I had in the corner, adjusting it 3 different times until his dad could lean back without wincing. He found my heating pad in the bathroom closet and plugged it in behind the chair, then grabbed extra pillows from my bed to support his dad's lower back. Michael stayed for 2 more hours, getting his dad water and making sure the muscle relaxers were working before he finally left for his night shift. James never showed up at the hospital, but that evening my phone buzzed with a text from him saying he was sorry about missing the emergency and that he'd been in a meeting he couldn't leave. The next morning, though, he actually showed up at my door with $50 in crumpled bills, counting them out on my kitchen table while my brother watched from the recliner. James wrote the date on a piece of paper and said this was the second payment, he'd keep them coming every week. 3 days later, Laura called to check on my brother's progress and asked about his recovery from the back spasm. She mentioned the VA had a new woodworking group starting up for veterans, said it might help him stay active without straining his back too much. My brother shook his head when I mentioned it, said he didn't need any more groups or therapy, but Laura had already put his name on the list and said to just try it once. The following Thursday, I drove him to the VA center for the woodworking class, even though he grumbled the whole way about wasting time. The instructor was another vet with a prosthetic leg who showed them how to use the basic tools safely, and my brother ended up at a workbench next to 3 other guys from different wars. They worked mostly in silence that first session, just the sound of sandpaper on wood and the occasional question about technique. My brother made a simple picture frame, nothing fancy, just 4 pieces of pine joined at the corners. But when he showed it to me in the car afterward, he was actually smiling, said the guy next to him had served in the same region of Iraq. He went back the next week without me having to convince him, and this time he started working on something more complex, a small jewelry box with a hinged lid. Carmen saw him sanding to pieces in my living room one evening when she stopped by to drop off groceries, and she picked up one of the small wooden panels to examine the grain. She asked what he was making, and when he said it was for her, her eyes got watery, and she asked if he could show her how to use the sandpaper properly. They spent the next 3 hours in my apartment, him teaching her about going with the grain and checking for rough spots with her fingertips, both of them focused on the wood instead of having to make eye contact. The next Saturday, I told my brother we were going shoe shopping, and he immediately started protesting about not needing anything. I drove us to the specialty shoe store anyway, the one that does custom orthotics, and made him sit down for a proper fitting. The salesman brought out 6 different pairs of orthopedic shoes, all with extra arch support and cushioned soles, and my brother kept saying they were too expensive. I reminded him about the decade he spent with duct tape, holding his shoes together while buying his kids new sneakers every season, and that shut him up pretty quick. We left with 2 pairs, one brown and one black, and he wore the brown ones out of the store even though he insisted on keeping the receipt in case I wanted to return them later. That night, Carmen sent a message to the family group chat with a new chat she'd created called Pizza Rain Check with a slice emoji. She listed 3 possible Saturday afternoons at a local pizza place, not New York, but at least it was something, asking everyone to vote on which date worked. Michael responded first with a thumbs up for the second option, James agreed to the same date, and my brother just sent a single checkmark. 2 weeks later, we were back in Suresh's office for our second mediated session. Everyone arriving on time this time. Suresh had prepared a simple written agreement based on our previous discussions. Nothing legally binding, but something everyone could sign as a commitment. The agreement laid out monthly dinners that the kids would cook on rotation, each kid attending 1 medical appointment per quarter with their dad, and that rain check for the New York trip when everyone could commit to a full day. Carmen signed first, then Michael, then James, and finally my brother added his signature at the bottom with that same careful handwriting he'd always had. The first dinner happened the following month at my apartment, with Carmen in charge of cooking while her brothers helped prep ingredients. The pasta came out mushy and stuck together in clumps, the garlic bread was black on the bottom, and the salad dressing was just oil and vinegar that hadn't mixed properly. But everyone showed up and nobody left early, and when James admitted he'd Googled how to boil water that morning, my brother actually laughed out loud for the first time in months. After dinner, my brother cleared his throat and announced he was keeping Sundays for himself from now on, that he'd only join family things on Sundays if he was specifically invited and wanted to attend. The kids all looked shocked. Carmen started to say something about family traditions, but Suresh reminded them this was healthy boundary setting, and they needed to respect it. 2 days later, James called my brother about his car making a weird noise and needing new brake pads. My brother listened to the whole explanation about the grinding sound and the mechanic's quote for $300. Then he just said no, calm as anything. No guilt in his voice at all. James went quiet for a few seconds, then said okay, and hung up without arguing or trying again. I was sitting right there watching my brother's face, and he looked surprised at how easy that was. The next morning, Carmen texted about this new Italian place that opened downtown with fancy wood-fired pizzas. She wanted to take him there for a belated birthday celebration, said she'd already made reservations for Saturday night. My brother typed back that he appreciated the offer, but needed more time before doing birthday stuff. Carmen just replied with a heart emoji and said to let her know when he was ready. No passive-aggressive follow-up texts, no making it about her feelings, just acceptance. That weekend, Michael came over to help with yard work, and while we were taking a water break, he mentioned something about their mom. He said he'd been thinking about putting a memorial bench at the park where she used to take them as babies. My brother's hands tightened on his water bottle, but he managed to say maybe next year when things felt more settled. Michael nodded and said that made sense, and they actually kept talking about her for another 10 minutes. They talked about how she always packed too many snacks for the park, and how she'd chase them around the playground even when she was pregnant. It was the first real conversation about her I'd heard in 20 years. Later that afternoon, I brought up an idea I'd been thinking about since the failed birthday trip. I suggested we could do quarterly train rides to different cities, just whoever could make it. No pressure if someone couldn't come. Each trip we'd try the best pizza place in that city and compare them to Joe's in New York. My brother's eyes actually lit up a little, and he said that sounded good because it took the pressure off any single trip being perfect. We could miss one, and there'd always be another coming up in 3 months. That night, he stayed up late at his kitchen table with a legal pad and 3 envelopes. He wrote each kid a letter, his damaged hands moving slowly across the paper. I could see him stopping to think between sentences, choosing his words carefully. He sealed each envelope and wrote their names on the front in his neat handwriting. The next day, he gave them out when the kids came for dinner and asked them to read them privately later. Carmen read hers in her car before driving home and texted him a long message about the memory he'd shared. She said she'd forgotten about the time he taught her to ride a bike in the rain because she insisted she was ready. Michael called that night and thanked him for remembering the science fair project they built together. James sent a simple text saying he understood the boundary about money and would respect it. Within a week, Carmen had sent everyone a calendar invite for weekly phone calls with her dad, complete with reminder alerts 15 minutes before. She scheduled them for Tuesday evenings when she knew she'd usually be home from work. James went to his bank and set up an automatic transfer for his $50 monthly payments, sending my brother a screenshot of the confirmation. Michael showed up one afternoon with his toolbox and fixed the doorknob that had been sticking for months. He also tightened all the cabinet hinges and replaced the weather stripping on the front door without being asked. Our third session with Suresh was different from the others because everyone seemed calmer and more settled. Suresh noted the positive changes in how everyone was interacting and suggested we pause regular sessions. He proposed scheduling a check-in for 6 months out to see how things were going. Everyone agreed this made sense, since the immediate crisis had passed, and now it was about maintaining the progress we'd made. My brother seemed relieved not to have weekly therapy anymore, but glad to know Suresh would still be available if needed. Laura called for what she said would be our final formal check-in, unless we needed her. She went through the safety plan point by point, and my brother had followed everything consistently. He was taking his medications on schedule, keeping his appointments, and hadn't had any crisis moments in weeks. She said he should keep her number and call if anything changed, but she could tell the medication adjustment was working well. He thanked her for everything, and I could hear real gratitude in his voice. The next Saturday, I invited everyone to my apartment for a belated birthday dinner with a twist. I'd bought ingredients for personal pizzas, and everyone would make their own. The kids actually showed up early to help set everything up. We rolled out dough and everyone picked their own toppings, even though James put way too much cheese on his. While the pizzas baked, each kid stood up and gave a short toast. Michael talked about how his dad never missed a football game, even when his back was killing him. James mentioned the time his dad stayed up all night helping him with a college essay, even though he'd worked 3 shifts that week. Carmen spoke last, and her voice stayed steady the whole time. She looked directly at her father and apologized for what she'd said at that dinner weeks ago. She didn't cry or make excuses or try to explain why she'd said it. She just owned that it was cruel and wrong, and she knew how much he'd sacrificed for them. She promised to do better going forward and said she understood if he needed time to forgive her. My brother nodded and reached over to squeeze her hand, and that was enough for now. James cleared his throat and pulled out his phone, showing my brother a spreadsheet he'd made with all his monthly expenses and a plan to pay back the money he'd borrowed over the years without asking for more help. My brother studied the screen for a long moment, then nodded slowly, and I saw something shift in his face like a weight lifting. Michael stood up next and admitted he'd been avoiding his dad because he was scared of what would happen when he got older and needed care, scared he'd have to give up his life the way his dad had given up everything for them. They talked about practical stuff like power of attorney and what kind of help he might need down the road, and for once Michael didn't look away or change the subject. After everyone left, my brother and I walked around the block even though his back was hurting, and he told me he'd thrown away that goodbye letter, but decided to keep the medals and flag to display properly in his living room, instead of hiding them in a shoebox. The crisis feeling that had been hanging over everything for weeks had finally passed, and I could see it in how he held himself a little straighter. A week later, he was back at his woodworking bench making a jewelry box while Michael actually showed up to drive him to physical therapy, something he'd never done before. The family group chat had a funny meme about trains that Carmen sent, and everyone confirmed they could make it to New York in 2 months on a specific date that James had researched for the best weather. Carmen started calling every Tuesday evening, no matter where she was for work, keeping the calls short, but asking about his day and telling him quick stories about her trips. She called from hotel rooms in Dallas and Seattle, and once from an airport in Chicago at midnight her time, never missing a week. James had made 3 $50 payments without missing any, and picked up weekend shifts at a warehouse to cover his loans instead of asking his dad for help, and the change was remarkable because he'd never held down extra work before. My brother mentioned one evening while we were watching TV that maybe he'd try dating again once he felt more stable, which completely stunned me since he hadn't talked about anyone but his late wife in 22 years. The kids were careful not to push, but Carmen found a senior singles group at the community center and casually left the flyer on his kitchen table, and Michael fixed up his dad's online dating profile from years ago that had never been activated. 3 months later, we were all standing at the train station platform again, but this time everyone had arrived 30 minutes early with tickets already purchased and snacks packed for the ride. Carmen had her hair pulled back and comfortable shoes on instead of her usual work heels. Michael had taken the whole day off and turned his phone to silent, and James had actually ironed a shirt for the occasion. My brother stood in the middle of his kids holding 4 tickets he'd bought just in case, even though everyone assured him they had their own. And when the train pulled up to track 3 right on time, nobody hesitated or looked at their phones or made excuses. We all climbed aboard together and found seats facing each other, and my brother sat by the window watching the city fade away as we headed toward New York. His kids actually talking to him about the pizza places they'd researched and which one to try first. The platform didn't feel haunted anymore, with its memories of him crying alone on that bench, because now it was just the place where his family had finally shown up when it mattered. Carmen took a photo of all of us on the train and immediately set it as her phone wallpaper, replacing whatever work thing had been there before. And James started a timer to see exactly how long the ride would take so they could plan better for next time. Michael pulled out a deck of cards he'd brought and taught everyone a game he'd learned in college. And for 3 hours, nobody mentioned work or money or obligations, just played cards and watched the scenery and talked about normal things like whether New York pizza was really better than Chicago style. My brother had tears in his eyes when we pulled into Penn Station, but they were different tears than before, and when we walked up those stairs into the city noise. And chaos, all 3 kids stayed close to him instead of wandering off or checking their phones, and Carmen linked her arm through his to help him navigate the crowds with his bad back. Thanks for wandering through all of this with me. It's been really interesting sharing these moments together. I'll catch you next time. Subscribe for more content like this.